So today we are going to be making homemade kombucha, and I'll take you through the entire process from making the tea to dealing with bottles to flavoring. So the first thing we're going to do is make the tea, which ferments with the SCOBY, which is a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. You'll see it in a second. It looks a little bit gross, but in fact, it probably looks a lot gross, but you put that in the tea and it ferments over a period of time based on your choice. So I got my pot here. It's a pretty large pot because I need 3.5 quarts of water. So that comes out to 14 cups. And I'm just going to use this. It's a 2-cup measuring. And I'll just add 7 of those because, you know, doing the math that I learned in elementary, 2 times 7 is 14. So there's 2. Okay, so there's that. I'm just going to put it on high heat so that it boils. Okay, so here I have the 3.5 quarts of water. I've just put it onto the stove so that it can boil. We're going to bring it, I have it on a high heat so that we can bring it to a boil pretty quickly. Then we will add our tea. I feel like my voice just cracked like I'm 14. We're going to add our tea and a little bit of sugar. I'll give you all the amounts as we go along. Okay, so the water's boiled. I've turned off the heat. We're going to next add 2 ingredients. First is 1 cup of just regular white sugar that you buy in the store. There are certainly other more fancy sugars out there, but you just don't need that. You just need regular white cane sugar because it's all about what the SCOBY likes, what is going to keep the SCOBY healthy and produce a good batch of kombucha. So plain white sugar, 1 cup. This is 1/4 cup, so I'm going to do 4 of these. One. 2. 3. Some of you may be tempted to not want to add as much sugar because you're thinking, oh, that's a lot of sugar. But keep in mind that the SCOBY is going to eat or feed on the sugar, and the longer you leave the tea to ferment with the SCOBY, the less sweet it is going to become. So it's a matter of, you know, after 7 days, tasting the SCOBY to decide if it has the right sweetness for your taste. The longer you leave it in, it's going to produce more of a vinegary taste. So I've added the sugar. I am going to stir this up to make sure it dissolves. Okay, that's good. And now I'm going to add my 8 tea bags of green tea. I've tied the ends all together because it just makes it easier to pull the tea out. And now I need this to come to room temperature because the SCOBY it doesn't like extreme heat, extreme cold, so I need this to be to room temperature before I add the SCOBY in. So it's a cold day here in Denver, so I am going to just sit the whole thing outside. So I'm ready to take this outside. I'm just going to add a lid on it and then carry the whole thing, sit it on the front porch. We should be ready in about an hour. You can see we're outside. We still have quite a bit of snow in the neighborhood, and so all of this is going to help the tea cool that much faster so that we can start bottling the kombucha. So the next step is to prepare the bottles, because once the tea cools, we'll then ferment this batch, but the batch that's already been fermenting for the last week or so, we're going to bottle. And so it just becomes this rotation where you make new batch, you bottle the old batch, and every week. So I usually try to do this on Saturday, but today is Sunday, which is fine as long as it's ready, by the early part of the week. Then I will have kombucha to take to work with me. In fact, part of the reasoning that I do it on the weekends is because I have coworkers that demand to taste the most recent batch of kombucha. And I like sharing it with them. All right, so what I'm doing now is I'm just cleaning out the sink so that I can sterilize the bottles from the last week's kombucha. Because even though I rinse the bottles after I drink the kombucha, it's important to still sterilize, clean the bottles before adding the new batch. So as you can see, I'm just filling up the sink with hot water. Then I'll add a little bit of just plain white vinegar. I said a little bit, but I meant a lot. These are the bottles I've ordered online. They're great because they have this locking cap mechanism that seals the bottle very tight so that in the second fermentation process, there are no gases that escape from the bottle, which help to carbonate the drink. So I'm going to rinse them. Some of them have old kombucha, last week's kombucha in them. So I'm just going to rinse them and put them in the vinegar water solution. Okay, so I'm letting the bottles just soak for a bit of time in this hot water. We're just going to wait for the tea to cool and then proceed from there. Now that the tea is cooled, I've brought it into the kitchen so that we can continue with the bottling process. But first, I want to show you the kombucha that's been fermenting over the last week. And it's just basically a gallon jar. You can see the SCOBY floating in there. Again, that's the symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast. And now that the first fermentation has completed, we're going to bottle it, add some juice flavoring, and this week I'm going to be using acai juice, which is an Amazon superfood juice. I like to use organic juices that don't have added sugar, just the most organic type ingredients for kombucha. Because if you're making a healthy drink, but then you're adding unhealthy sweeteners and things like that, then you're not really doing yourself any favors. So right now what I'm going to do, you have to make sure your hands are super clean for handling the SCOBY. So I am going to scrub them up here. The other thing you want to make sure is that your SCOBY does not come into contact with anything metal. Glass is fine, plastic is fine, but metal can damage the SCOBY and make it unhealthy. And you don't want to have an unhealthy SCOBY because you don't want to make kombucha that will ultimately make you sick. All right, so now that I've scrubbed my hands, I am going to take the lid off the bottle, that's the jar that's been fermenting for the past week. And I don't know if you can see this, but there's the SCOBY floating in there. And on top, there's like this gelatinous film, and that's essentially a baby SCOBY that has started to form. So what will end up happening is, over time, your old SCOBY will produce a baby, which you can share with friends that also want to start making their own kombucha. But we don't need it for today, and it's still, so I'm going to reach in and pull this out. And you can see it's just like this jellyfish looking thing. Gross. It can be a little gross. So I can still use that for the next fermentation in this jar, along with the mother SCOBY that's kind of floating at the bottom. But basically what I want to do at this point, remove the SCOBY and also take out 2 cups of this fermented tea to add to the new batch we are brewing today. So I'm just going to reach in here, grab the old SCOBY out. Oh, I'm making a mess. Okay. So here's the SCOBY. It kind of looks like a mushroom / jellyfish. It has a consistency of like a wet mushroom. So I put this in my plastic container. Now I'm going to take out 2 cups of the fermented tea to use for the next batch. And again, we're using plastic or glass. So I have a glass jar here. It has a 2-cup line. I'm just going to pour 2 cups in there. I almost said a bad word. Okay. And this smells really vinegary, kind of, it smells a little odd, but that's normal. So I'm going to rest my SCOBY that I took out of the jar in this plastic container along with the 2 cups I just took out. All right. Now what I'm going to do is I have a 1/3 cup that I'm going to add. I'm going to pour 1/3 cup of juice in each of the 6 bottles for flavoring. And then what will happen is when I add the fermented tea in there, that tea will continue to feed off the sugars in that juice and create carbonation to make the kombucha fizzy. And I use 1/3 cup of juice. You can choose to use as much or as little as you need based on your preference. So, in each of these bottles, I'm going to pour 1/3 cup of acai juice. Okay, so now that there's juice in each of these bottles, I am going to add 1 3/4 cups of the fermented tea to each of the bottles. And that should be enough to get us to enough. I should have enough tea to fill all 6 bottles. Now, as I pour the tea in there, I make sure that I pour it through a strainer because there's a bunch of floating culture bacteria things in this that are not necessarily desirable to drink. I like to strain them out. They're not bad for you, it's just doesn't always seem fun to drink those floating things. Okay, that's one bottle. Here's the second. And I don't want to fill the bottles completely to the top because I want to allow a tiny bit of room so that the bottles don't explode, because there is going to be a buildup of gases that create the carbonation. So I want to give them a little bit of room. And even though this fermented tea has a real pungent kind of smell to it, the juice will interact with it, and by the time you're ready to drink it, it will be delicious. I am to the point now where I have people that I work with asking for a sip of, or a shot glass. They bring in their own shot glasses every day so that they can have a taste of the new batch of kombucha. All right, we're on bottle number 5. And as you can see, this tea has a nice light green color, which is the reason why I like to use green tea, because I just like the color. Black tea is probably, as I said earlier, black tea is the first choice because it has more of the nutrients that the SCOBY likes. But green tea is the second choice. My preference is just for the color of the tea. I like green. All right, so they're all done. I have a little bit left, no big deal. I'm going to throw that out. Okay, so I've added the juice and the fermented tea to each of the bottles. Now all I have to do with these is just seal them up and let them go through a second fermentation of 1 to 2 days. And I'm just going to keep them in a spot that is out of direct sunlight and is kind of warm for 1 to 2 days. Then I'll put them in the refrigerator to stop the second fermentation slash carbonation process, and then they're ready to drink. So as I seal these, carbonation is going to start to build up over time. You want to make sure you don't forget about the bottles, because after a couple days, you may end up with a situation where the bottles burst from the buildup of carbonation. So 1 to 2 days. All right, so these are my finished bottles. Can you see that? Yes. All right. Okay, now we're going to move on to the final. Oh, I want to show you this first. See, this is all the stuff we strained out of the fermented tea. You can see that that does not seem desirable to drink. Not bad for you, but it seems kind of gross. All right. So now I don't need that. So now we're going to go and I'm going to wash out the jar so that we can reuse it to brew or to ferment the new batch of tea. And I'll be back. Okay, so I've washed the jar that we're going to use to ferment the new batch of kombucha. And from the old batch that we brewed, I've saved 2 cups of the fermented tea from last week. And in here, I also have the SCOBY. There's also a baby SCOBY down underneath. I'm going to put it all in the new batch. Allow the new SCOBY to grow. And I just feel bad about killing it because it just started its life. All right, so this is the tea that we had cooling outside. It's got grass on it because I sat it in the snow, remember? Okay. All right. Well, in this pot is the tea with the sugar. So just enough sugar, 1 cup, so that the SCOBY will have some food to eat on. And I'm going to take the 2 cups from last week's batch and add it to this tea. The reason for that is we're going to let this tea sit around for a week to 10 days. And by adding the fermented tea from last week, it keeps this from going bad or turning rancid. So you don't have to worry about it just becoming gross and growing mold and stuff that you don't want. Okay, so I put 2 cups of last week's tea in there. I'm going to stir that up. Here we go. So I have the newly brewed tea, the 2 cups of the old fermented tea in here. Now I'm just going to pour this into our fermentation bottle. Jar. It's more a jar. Oops. That's a nice color. So clear. Looks really refreshing. That's why I prefer the color of the green tea. Okay. So we're going to handle the SCOBY again with our hands, so I'm going to wash my hands again just to be on the safe side. Okay, so now I just put the SCOBY into the new batch of tea, and that little baby, oops, sorry, it's kind of like a glob now, but it'll straighten itself out. So I put that in there. Live. Okay. I'm going to spread it out a little bit. Don't cry. Okay. So now the SCOBY's in there, the baby one's on top. You can kind of see it floating there. And I am going to cover this jar with 3 coffee filters. And basically there's some gases building up in here, so you want the jar to be able to breathe, but you don't want any insects to get at it. So That's why the 3 layers of coffee filters. You can also use cheesecloth, but make sure you have enough layers so that fruit flies or any small insects won't be able to get into the jar, but the jar can still breathe while it's fermenting. So here we are. This is our fresh batch. It's going to ferment for 7 to 10 days, and then we'll do this process all over again. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Again, my name is Nick Miller. This is Electric U. Subscribe, and you'll get our other videos that come out shortly.